You're listening to the Nature Connections Show with Sara Estelle, your direct connection. So welcome everybody to this week's Nature Connections Show. My name is Sara Estelle. This week my guest is Chris Phillips, who is a flower essence therapist with 30 years experience, and also the author of a brand new book called Treating Depression Naturally. Now, Chris works in a way that's very dear to my own heart, in that he embraces and uses lots of different ranges of flower essences, which I think is always really, really useful for a very well-rounded way of looking at treating our emotional well-being. And I love the book myself, and it was really important for me to give Chris the opportunity to share a little bit about the book and his work here with you today. So a big welcome to you, Chris, to the Nature Connection Show.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Hello, everybody.
Yeah, you're very welcome. So we're here today to kind of shine a little bit of light on this word, depression, which is so used. Something we all feel sometimes, but then there are so many people for whom depression casts large and very limiting and debilitating shadows on their life. So I thought it might be an idea to maybe ask you what you feel depression is and why it is so very prevalent nowadays.
I think depression is something that is absolutely unique to the individual, and yet there seems to be some kind of common thread that goes through it all. I have in mind that we get into depression when we need a timeout, but I also have the idea that we get pushed into it by keeping our anger down. We get pushed into it by loss sometimes, by being shoved back into old grief, perhaps by something that seems almost quite small. And we manifest that depression in our very own way. And that's why it looks so very different from all of us. And why, certainly in the book, I've tried to reflect as many different facets of it as I possibly could, and address helpful essences.
Yeah. It was one of the things that really struck me about your book, and one of the reasons I love it so much. And although emotional well-being is my area of specialization, like yours, it really kind of like brought it home to me that something like depression is so very individual. So by treating it, if you like, with one thing, which the pharmaceutical industry might do, makes it can be less than helpful sometimes. And by actually embracing the individual aspect of it is so very helpful. So you've done a great job at doing that. I know this is a kind of like really big question, but again, maybe it's just worth touching on it. I wonder if depression is really more prevalent nowadays, or whether it's always been here, it's just a facet of the human being. It's certainly talked about more nowadays. Whether modern life creates that space inside us where we might call ourselves depressed. What are your thoughts on that?
I think here in the West, there's a lot expected of us and of our individuality, and in a way, we expect a lot back. We don't always get those expectations met. We get angry about it. Anger is not something that we can easily express because we're discouraged from it. I think that our whole upbringing is very often that we live in a society and anger is inconvenient, embarrassing, and ought to be put down. And we're bred to this from childhood. And that does seem to be a thread that runs through many of these varieties of depression. This big emotion that we can't properly put out is something that shuts us down in a way. I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah, so I guess you're kind of saying, which I agree with, that modern life, how it is manifesting, is kind of is contributing to the feelings of depression that some of us may experience.
Yes, I think that's exactly so. And I do think that it's more prevalent in the West now than it has been. I can't really speak for the rest of the world, but we seem to run at a different rate here, and that's why it's perhaps our disease more than others.
Yeah, and I remember when we first had a chat before we recorded this interview, you mentioned that one of the reasons you chose to address depression in your book was because you were seeing so many clients who were coming with that to you for help.
Yes, the book, in fact, came out of a data sheet. I just started producing notes on what worked, on what helped with depression, and looking at the different aspects of it. And I realized that my notes on that subject were larger than my notes on anything else. And it tended to follow from that over a number of years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and a lot's been said nowadays, isn't it, about there's lots of research been done on, as we go more into an online world, and other aspects as well, we are becoming more disconnected from nature, and that nature, being in nature, is one of the greatest ways to connect us back to ourselves and therefore lift a depression or an anxiety state.
Yes, certainly. Just being out there, getting out into nature is a way of re-engaging with our bodies, with all of us. Exercising is a way of saying, look, I'm not living in my head entirely, I'm using the rest of me. And this brings us back into balance. This is, of course, what flower essences are doing, what all kinds of vibrational essences are doing so well. They are getting us back into balance. They're looking at the difficult bits and saying, okay, that's a difficult emotion that I've got here. I don't want to lose that emotion entirely. I want to get it back into balance.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that you talked about pharmaceuticals, and really they can be so helpful to people. But the truth of the matter is that they just work on the symptoms. They don't go to the core. They don't actually go to the beginning. That isn't their intention. And many people find that without going back to the beginning, they are not getting to where they need to be. They're not being able to work effectively, to lift their depression effectively.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the essences come in.
So they can be used together, really, aren't they? That's one of the things I wanted to ask you. If anybody's listening who is already being treated via their doctor, via their GP, is it okay to take flower essences as well?
They seem to work very happily with all other types of pharmaceutical medication, indeed all other types of therapy that I've ever come across. Yeah. They don't get in the way of each other.
So, as there may be some people listening, and I hope they are, who are new to flower essences, because I know you and I share a passion to allow as many people as possible to find out about the modality. Could you share just a little bit about what flower essences are and how we take them and how they can help? And then what we're going to do is talk about specific areas of depression and some essences that might help. But let's start off by talking about what they are, just for somebody who might not know.
Essences are literally the essence of the flowers or the vibrations that are chosen to balance us. We're vibrational beings. We're vibrational beings at their core, and this is something that physics understands extremely well. And the essences have a vibrational structure. And when that vibrational structure gets in among us, it has the capability of balancing us, of balancing our emotions, particularly, of balancing our difficult mental states. And so we look at these big emotions and we choose essences for them. So if we're dealing with anger, we might choose Dr. Bach's Holly. If we're looking at grief, we might choose Dr. Bach's Water Violet. If we're looking at low self-esteem, we might go to Larch, for example. And all of these emotions are not there to be suppressed. They're there to be moderated, as it were. If they're too strong for us, then they're going to make life very inconvenient. Essences can take away that inconvenience. They can bring the emotions back into balance, and we can get on with our lives.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. They are one of the sort of hidden secrets of natural medicines, aren't they? And I think it's starting to change now, and hopefully we can contribute to that by our discussion today. So, as we mentioned, in your book, Treating Depression Naturally, you have very cleverly and in a very, very easy way divided the book up into different areas of depression. We don't have the time to look at all of them today, but just looking at the back of the book, you mention areas like obsessive compulsive disorder, low self-esteem, grief and loss, seasonal affective disorder, hormonal depression, anxiety, just to name a few, and there's many more than that. So for the purposes of today, we've chosen 3 areas that we'd just like to talk to you a little bit about, and to mention an essence or 2 from each category that might be helpful to you. So I think one of the things that we keep being drawn back to, Chris, is the word anger.
Yeah.
And how it's a facet of depression of all different kinds. So can you talk to us a little bit about how you have found that and how it manifests and the importance of healthy anger?
I think that what my observations have drawn me to is the depth that we go back to. We need to go back to the very beginning, that it seems to be that in the very, very beginning, children have anger. I found myself working recently with a child that was 7 weeks old, and it had infant colic, and it was an angry baby. It looked very healthy to me, but the mother was holding the baby and saying, "Well, I didn't want this baby. When I was carrying the baby, I broke my knee and had to go into hospital, and there was the baby. There was I carrying the baby in hospital, being operated on for my knee, and the birth was difficult, and the whole thing was laid out in front of me. And then when I looked at it, I found that the baby was carrying this anger, carrying this grief at the difficult life that he'd been introduced to, and displaying all of the problems that people in their adulthood could do. And this really seemed to bring the point home that these big emotions, anger, grief, and very often guilt, because the baby from the beginning is forming its personality, is developing its ego. It looks at the world through its eyes, and when the world's not going very well, it knows who to blame, and it blames itself. The baby blames herself or himself for the things that are going wrong, and carries guilt indefinitely. Anger seems to be there from the very beginning, and if we get occasion for anger at a later stage, we either express it sometimes outrageously, or we repress it, and we can then drop into depression all too easily.
Yeah, I know when I first started my essence journey, and for all of us, it's always ongoing. I didn't know that part of myself at all, the part of myself that could express anger, because it wasn't. I came or come from a family where anger wasn't. We didn't show anger. Nobody showed me how to do it. And so life went on in its surface ways. There was a lot of love. It wasn't a bad family in that way. But anger, I just wasn't given a model for it, so I didn't know how to do it. And essences have taught me so much about that.
Yes, I think so. I think that it's a great start, isn't it, to sort of recognize that big emotion and see what one can do with it.
Yeah.
And there are essences that seem to really help to bring it back into.
Yes. And I'm what I'm hearing from us talking is the word balance as well. Is like this baby who was displaying anger that was maybe out of balance, in the sense that it was angry all the time or a lot of the time, whereas people maybe a little bit like myself as a teenager or as a very young woman didn't know how to express it, so kept it all inside. So it's finding that middle point.
Yes, yes, exactly so. You don't want a baby to lose its ability to cry, to express its anger, but you do want it not to be angry all the time. And I think it's the same for all of us. You don't want the young girl, the young person to be unable to say when things are not going right, to be able to express it clearly. In some families, I think that's allowed. In the past, there have been too many families where it's been too embarrassing, and the training of the child, the education of the child, has been to dampen down that anger, to not express it at all, to a point where the child loses the understanding of what the emotion is for.
So it's a big area, isn't it? A very big area. And flower essences are always chosen individually. So, but let's try. If there were a couple of essences, if somebody listening recognizes what we're saying, where would they maybe start? Where would be a good place to start for them to help them with that anger?
Well, if we're working with that particular emotion, I think you could start with Dr. Bach's Holly very safely. It's the essence that deals with all that is the opposite of love. It deals with jealousy, it deals with hatred, it deals with bitterness, and brings us back into the original love where we all came from and where we all hope perhaps to get back to. That seems the starting point. If you look at Ian White's essences, I suppose the Dagger Hakia and the Mountain Devil, and they have a family aspect to it as well, and I think that's quite interesting. Those two essences seem to be dealing with strong reactions within the family, and that often naturally relates to people in the light of what we've been saying. I found Forsythia comes up a great deal from the Pacific essences, and that's extremely useful at balancing anger.
Okay, so the batch essences are the most easily found essences, I think, because there could be people listening or watching this from literally all over the world. So the batch essences are easily found. In Chris's book, Treating Depression Naturally, there is a resources section in there, isn't there, Chris, where people can actually go and find the different ranges you mentioned?
Yes, there are. You can actually go directly to the maker, or they have a representative, a retailer in this country, and you can source these through the web. And I've given the web addresses.
Excellent.
To the book there. Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to the next area that we chose to talk about today, which was hormonal depression. So I'm sure there's lots of ladies listening who understand this. So I guess this could be at all different ages of a woman's journey, and possibly for a man too. You know, I don't think we should forget that this can manifest too for men as they age, although clearly it's a different being, but it's maybe some similar, the emotions might be similar. So talk to us a little bit about the hormonal depression and what you feel is the difficulty there.
I think that in a way, these hormonal depressions come at that time of change in a person's life. Looking at womanhood, it's the girl moving into adolescence, and certainly the period around having a baby or failing to have a baby is something that brings in all kinds of swirling, difficult emotions, because the woman seems to be asked to sort things out. She's actually getting an opportunity, in a way, to look at the difficult stuff in her life, and she's perhaps finding it hard to accommodate a new baby because her own mother had difficulties which were acknowledged or unacknowledged, but they were built into the woman herself, and they're brought out at this time to be looked at and adjusted. There's a lot in this notion of depression being a period of reflection, a time for reflection, where you can actually go out and adjust the way that you look at the world and adjust those difficult emotions that are inconveniencing you, that are guiding you or apparently misguiding you. But if we have this upsurge of hormones, they liberate us in a way. They make it more easy to get to the bottom of things. And I think that I've taken that attitude with the essence is that if one can look at this with an open mind, look at the problems reflected in the book and see the essences that are attracted to those, then this could be helpful. Obviously, anger that we've just been discussing is one of the emotions, but fear can be an issue too. The ability to control events is challenged. If one feels that you can manage the world in a certain way, you've got used to doing that, then a baby is the very best way of challenging that notion for a start. And you have to look at how you interact with the world that includes your baby with it. Mm-hmm. And a lot can be learned at this time.
Absolutely, yes. And there are chapters of your book, aren't there, that deal with postpartum depression and also menopause and also aging. So that could bring in the aspects of depression, which are very real for all of us as we age and our bodies change. So again, it's a very, very big area. But if there are any, probably ladies, not wishing to exclude the men, but it is an area that maybe women will understand more from a hormonal point of view. Could you mention maybe one or two essences that might be helpful for hormonal depression?
Well, I did mention controlling as being a feeling that's challenged when the baby comes along. Dr. Bach's vine is helpful there, and also rock water itself, which is an amazing essence in that it is derived from spring water rather than from particular flowers, but it has this helpful characteristic of loosening things up. The walnut essence from the Bach range does the same thing. I also find that poison hemlock from Pacific Essences is very valuable, and sea palm, they're good essences at managing this this need to control one's world, bringing that back into balance.
Mm.
So I think those are the ones that sort of stick in my mind as essences to consider at a time like this.
Mm-hmm. You know, the essence that jumped out at me, talking as a woman of a certain age, whose hormones are changing, was the orange honeysuckle from the Pacific range for
Yes.
embracing the creativity as we lose it in one sense of, just reminding the body that we are always creative. It just changes its nature.
I couldn't agree more. It's a wonderful essence that has that manages, on the one hand, to deal with difficult aspects of our work and shows the way forward. It's such a creative essence.
Lovely, yeah. Okay, so let's move on to the third area, and I think we're realizing, and it's good for us all to see this, that what we're talking about through all the three areas are very similar things. There's a similar theme goes through them. But the third area we chose to talk about was that of young people, and taking us back really to where we almost began, was talking about how as the world changes, it's becoming more and more apparent that lots of young people are really struggling.
Yes, that comes out strongly. A lot is expected of them, and yet their teachers, and I mean that in the broadest sense, their parents, their teachers, the adults, the people who hand the world onto them, are expecting a great deal of them, and yet those very adults seem to have given them a very messed up world to deal with, and they don't seem to be taking very much account of it. And so these children grow into adulthood experiencing repressed anger that we've talked about, frustrated ability to control that we've talked about, and also, I think, fear. And this is something that isn't always obvious, but can be locked within them. You're inheriting a world which is under threat, and it's pretty natural to be fearful of it. And I think this is the other element that is very strong in these children. Grief, maybe, but fear impresses me there.
Yes, yes. So if there are any young people listening, or maybe teachers or parents who would like to help their young people, what might be an essence or two that they could turn towards to start their journey?
I like Bailey's Cypress Rock Rose very much. It has that ability to transmute fearfulness into to give a perspective to it, and this is something that comes out in that depressive notion of taking stock, of actually looking again and just drawing some deep breaths and going forward. And Cypress Rock Rose is a very nice essence from that point of view. Yeah. Grey Spider Flower from Ian White's Bush Essences. Mm-hmm. And of course, Dr. Bach himself has the aspen, the mimulus, the specific fears, and his own rock rose essence. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So those essences deal with fear, I think.
Yeah, lots of ideas. Thank you, Chris. It's been, as we said at the beginning, it's a huge subject. I hope we've done it a little bit of justice as we've talked together today. Thank you very, very much for sharing your time and wisdom with us today. Thank you for writing your beautiful book. If anybody would like to know more about the work that you do, because I know you also offer flower essence consultations yourself, or would like to purchase your book, can you tell them how they can do that?
Well, I think that the book, it comes from Floris, the publishers. That's easiest to go onto the Floris website, and they can actually read a couple of chapters of the book there. And my own website is at flower-therapy.co.uk. I think I've got that right.
Yeah. Yeah. So Floris publishers, Floris is spelt Floris, and we'll put the link.
Oris.
Oh yeah, did I say that wrong? I did. Floris. Yes. We'll put the link up in its written form alongside the interview. Right. Yeah. So thank you again. Thank you again. Anybody listening or watching, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear how this has helped you, or if it touches you, and if you know somebody to whom this might be helpful, we'd love it if you could share it as well, because Chris and I share a big passion of knowing how much essences can help us in very deep ways, and in ways that not other modalities can. So it would be wonderful if we can shift and help people in small or big ways via this interview.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for listening. And I think my closing thought was the importance of looking at the words in the book, of thinking about our difficulties and depression, and using the intuition. That seems to be key in getting us to the essences we need, or to the thoughts that we need to get out of our difficulties.
Yes, absolutely, being drawn. So, to trust our heart, that when something, catches our attention somewhere, to follow the trail and go and look with curiosity. So absolutely. Okay, thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.